The more I look into Yooka Laylee, the more I'm looking forward to it. It's amazing to think that only a few years ago this would have been seen as a generic nothing release. But since the disappearance of the kid-friendly platformer as a reliable genre, you've seen some... Wait, I'm gonna start again. In the olden days, games were simple, for they ran on limited hardware. And I mean limited hardware. And the reclusive nature of computers meant that games were generally made for the arcade machines. Then the home console arrived, and a bunch of barely working games flooded the market. This meant that quality was low, and thus desire to play games was dwindling. But Nintendo did two things to offset these developments. Number one, they forced a seal of quality for release on their console, and number two, they marketed their console as a toy. This meant that to reliably get on a Nintendo console, you needed to be kid-friendly. And since Nintendo's machine mainly offered an interactive visual audible experience, developers had to create something that fits that mold, and along came the reliability of the kid-friendly platformers. But then PlayStation came and upped the ante with Crash, whose attitude dwarfed that of Sonic's, and a more lenient seal of quality. This gave rise to the Resident Evils, the Silent Hills, the Metal Gear Solids, the Tomb Raiders, and the Final Fantasies VIIs. And with the PlayStation 2 you saw a rise in more violent and less cartoony games. Spurred on by Grand Theft Auto, Jak and Daxter went from a Zelda Crash hybrid to a Zelda GTA hybrid, and Spyro got ditched for Ratchet, who could hold guns. Suddenly the mainstay games that defined their generations had a bigger emphasis on combat, and when Xbox arrived, bringing with it the vindication of console multiplayer and the military shooters, suddenly no one cared about platformers. But now we have Kickstarter, where nostalgic adults will pay millions of dollars for the promise of the good old days. And one of the most universally lauded projects was Yooka Laylee, which promises to bring back the kid-friendly platformer. And I think the reason this will work is because you have some of the Rare devs making it, and Rare used to be a heavy hitter in quality titles. It's funny to think that Rare might have actually killed the kid-friendly platformer themselves by releasing GoldenEye 64, but I suppose the evolution of the medium was inevitable. Anyway, the point of this video is to talk about Yooka Laylee and why it excites me. Here's a quiz for you. What game features a first-person perspective, a military setting, brown levels, a set-piece oriented single player, and a nothing multiplayer? Too many to count, and that's odd. This is describing a very specific game, and even if I gave you the name of each gun and character, you might still not name the game. Because too many games play the same, and it's a big problem in the medium. No one has the guts to release a game with an original playstyle, but as soon as someone does, everybody starts to copy it. When Call of Duty Modern Warfare came out, everybody wanted to do the modern military shooter. When Arkham Asylum released, everyone wanted to use that combat and tech division. When Skyrim released, everyone wanted to do an open world exploration. And we are seeing a massive rise in Demon's Souls clones. This speaks to a problem of originality, because when every game plays the same, every game is the same. A different story, characters and map packs don't make a different game. Silent Hill with cover shooting is just Gears of War. Silent Hill needs mechanics that push isolation, desperation and intrigue of the unknown to work. And every game should ideally play like no other game. I know this might be a problem with our limited selections of controllers, but if you know how to work with hardware, you can make millions of different playstyles with the same 20-ish button controller layout. And what I like from what I've seen from Yooka Laylee is that it doesn't look like most games. I will get into this more later, but for now, I just look forward to playing this. And speaking of looking forward to playing this, my little sisters saw the trailer and asked me if they could play. This is huge to me because I love games and I want to share my love of games with the people I love. But the people I love aren't interested in military shooters, and since every game is derivative of military shooters these days, they aren't interested. But this just has them hyped, and that may be because it's a kid game. How many kid games are releasing this game with these production values? Not as many as just 10 years ago, and certainly not as many as 20 years ago. Unless you count the mobile scene. And I know everyone loves to hate on mobile, and how kids these days really don't know what quality games are, but guess what? mobile is the only large gaming scene where innovation is commonplace. Derivative clones are common as well, but no heavily marketed AAA game is being released with an original playstyle on consoles or PCs. And the fact that kids are flocking in drones over to mobile tells me two things. There is more innovation on that scene, and there are more kid games on that scene. And if anything will kill the console, it will be a lack of kid games, because without a steady increase in player base, there is no growth, and when anything stops growing, it starts deteriorating. Yooka Laylee is not the cure for these problems, but it makes me hopeful that one day I'll play games on the same device as the younger generation, and it makes me hopeful that the main sellers of the console platform might be something else than brown-filtered armymen, blue-filtered armymen, blue-filtered sociopath, black-filtered armymen, brown-filtered gas masks, and the like. I know I'm cherry-picking here, but this is what non-gamers see, and not without reason. These games look the same because they are marketing the same experience. A power fantasy. And so many of these games play the same. Having recently played through Super Mario 64, the most interesting thing it left me with was the desire to explore. And no, not in an Elder Scrolls Diablo kind of way, but in traversing an area in interesting ways. Movement in that game is really fun. When was the last time you played a game and just had hours of fun walking? Not from point A to point B to get to the action scenes, but in an area which was designed to be moved through. When making Super Mario 64, Shigeru Miyamoto made the team focus on how Mario would move, and his mantra was, the maps will be made when Mario is fun to move in and of himself. The first thing they did was plop him in an area and have him chase the rabbits. When that was fun, the levels were made, and this mantra made 3D gaming. Say what you want about Miyamoto, but his philosophy of design is brilliant, and it is a philosophy that doesn't really mess with the industry standards of just using old styles and barely iterating on them with new graphics and new gun models. This may not be a point in Yooka Laylee's favor, seeing as it is a retread of an old style of play, but it's at least different. It's not something I've been playing for the past few years, it's not similar to every other game on the shelf. It stands out, and it makes me excited to play something that is something else. If the added mechanics are the message is true, then I suppose the message of Yooka Laylee would probably be fun and or friendship. Both of whom have been kinda neglected in recent years. Although I guess fun is everywhere, but it seems like a lot of games are afraid of being about fun. But everything in Yooka Laylee just screams it. The art style invokes Sunday morning cartoons and brings back memories of Banjo-Kazooie. And that game also had the apparent themes of fun and friendship. And although fun isn't gone from the medium, I think friendship kind of is. The mechanical reliance on more than one animating object can be very useful in contextualizing our reliance on each other. This makes me happy because I'm a social person and like to be around people, and if I can point to Yooka Laylee and say it's about friendship, I think more people will believe me than if I point to Dead Rising and say it's about fun. So friendship as a theme. Sappy? Childish? Maybe. But it's also earnest, and that will appeal to the mature demographic. And make no mistake, this game is being made for the mature demographic. After all, it was nostalgic adults that financed it, and much like Pixar movies, I think an underscored brilliance of this game is that it will appeal to all demographics. And if you think it won't, just look at the highest selling games of all time. Broad appeal makes makers rich. And since this is something that has hype and creative energy behind it, I think I can say that although it might not be a billion-dollar product at launch, it will launch to make some ripples, and will hopefully inspire more devs to use this format in the future. And why not? The kid-friendly platformer is a format that works. No one questions the narrative sense of Mario obtaining stars to rescue Peach, but that's not to say that it doesn't make any. As long as the narrative establishes rules and then follows the rules, then it is making narrative sense. A lot of the realistic games will establish realism as a major theme before having you point and click your way through hundreds of enemies, and that's not something that's gonna be fixed by any game development. It's something that's gonna be abandoned for the betterment of the medium. Games should ideally tell their stories through the application of mechanic interplay and manipulation of player psychology and context. But if we're going to use text boxes, cutscenes and scripted events, I'd much rather see something cartoony or camp and self-aware. That's kinda what makes Metal Gear Solid so great. I feel like I've stayed on this subject long enough, but I kinda wanna explain why this presentation works better than the alternative. You see, video games are inherently abstract. They don't often make a lot of real-world sense, and if you want to use them to tell real-world stories, then you're likely to hit a cringe curve. This is another application of the uncanny valley, but the closer you try to emulate reality, the weirder things are going to be. This can be averted by playing to the weirdness, like in Snake Eater, Devil May Cry, or Resident Evil 4. But if you want to do realism, then maybe you should just make movies. Games are better used to entertain the analytical brain because they're really just a bunch of overlapping rules. The reason the kid-friendly platformer works as a video game is because it's presenting a cartoony world whose logic we must infer rather than project on. This means that anything goes, and as long as we don't pick up on contradiction in the presentation, we aren't likely to question that reality we're being presented with. Oftentimes to evolve, things must look back. Star Wars used 40s era serials to force 70s era Hollywood into the future, and Watchmen used 40s era superhero tropes to force comics into the future. I don't think this is definitely going to bring the future of video games to the forefront. I'm just saying there's historical precedent for this kind of project to do that. It's funny to think that maybe Yooka Laylee will be the Watchmen of video games, isn't it? A good example within our own medium is Shovel Knight, and Shovel Knight makes me giddy for Yooka Laylee. Shovel Knight, you see, was pitched, funded and sold on the promise of delivering nostalgia, and 2 years after release, it is without a doubt my favorite game of 2014. And a big part of that is the fact that Shovel Knight is a perfect blend of old and new. Had Shovel Knight released in the heyday of the SNES, it would have been regarded as one of the medium's finest offerings. And I feel the same way about Yooka Laylee. And seeing as Yooka Laylee is being developed by essentially Rare, I look forward to seeing how Yooka Laylee will advance the 3D platformer, like how Shovel Knight advanced the 2D platformers. Now, I know it isn't wise to hail a game with praise before it's even released, but I want to implore people to be very optimistic, because there is creative energy. This is a 3D platformer being made by some of the best 3D platformer creators that have been wanting to do something like this for years, but have been forced to make peripheral games for an owner that doesn't respect the legacy of the studio they purchased, nor the audience of said studio. This is the kind of setup that ends up in creativity magic. This is how Pillars of Eternity was made. This is how Bloodstained will be made. This is a trend I want to see more of. I want to see creative people be creative in this medium, and I want to see more opportunities for original ideas to shine. And that's what I like most about Yooka Laylee. I like how this game speaks to the future of development. This game was made possible by Kickstarter, by a dialogue between devs and players, and I love that. I love the idea of outside-the-box thinking being given massive attention, and I love how that kind of business is becoming standardized. I look forward to the day when consoles will have their own version of Kickstarter, where you simply pledge support to projects you would enjoy. I love how this game was made possible only by recentest developments in the industry, and I love how I can look forward to many years of this kind of industry practice. Also, I want to see a spooky level if possible, and maybe someone to resurrect isolation horror.